Hi, everyone. Welcome to part two of the colonial urge to commodify the climate crisis. Willow Prince, Le Suzy, Engez Dakashkana, Nakasli Waten, Batsahashia. My name is Willow Prince. I'm from Nakasli Waten, otherwise known as the place where arrowheads fly. My home is in the northern lands of what we currently uncomfortably and non-consensually call British Columbia, Canada. Here at ICA, I'm the climate leadership facilitator. And yeah, today we are joined by Ariel Deranger, Tomas Lopez Jr., Danielle Frank, and Kati George-Jim. And today will be a conversation around real solutions, real Indigenous-led solutions in our communities and beyond, at the local, the national, and the international level. I will pass this on to Danielle for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Willow. It's so great to see you and everybody else here. Thank you for joining us. Hello, my name is Danielle Frank, and I am a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe, also of Yurok descendancy, both located in Northern California. And I'm really excited to be here today. I met Willow in one of the and Tomas in one of these spaces where land defenders kind of just turn into family. So excited to be here with everyone. And yeah, excited for this conversation. I'll go ahead and pass it off to Tomas.
Buenos dias. My name is Tomas Lopez Jr. Also, a lot of people know me as Land Back Baddie. Was born and raised in what is now Northern Arapaho Cheyenne Ute territory, but is now Commerce City, Colorado. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today. I talk about many different aspects of land back through the platform that I've built. And I really enjoy honing in on what it means to be a Native person today, and not only carrying and holding our traditional and historical backgrounds, but also existing in the modern spaces that have been created with not really us in mind. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here today and just talk with these amazing other young people about the ways in which Indigenous leadership should be put in the center of almost everything that we do. So I will pass it to Ariel.
Masicho, iklanete denesotlaneta, Ariel Tseekwe Deranger Betsiani Hasli. Hello, my name is Ariel Tseekwe Deranger. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is located in the Treaty 8 territories of northern so-called Alberta. I'm also the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, and I currently live and reside in Treaty 6 territory in the Enoch Cree Nations lands and territories just outside of Amiskwaci, Waskayagan, also known as Edmonton. And I'm really excited to be here today. You know, this is a long-standing conversation that I've been a part of both at the regional, national, and international level. And what's even more exciting is to be a part of this discussion with some incredible leaders and young people that are taking this work and bringing some of the visions and the advocacy of some of the people even before me have worked so hard to ensure that this is possible. So just really excited to be on this panel with some amazing young people that are taking charge and leading real solutions for our communities. I will pass it to Kati George.
Hello, my given name is Huisquacha, and that name comes from my mother's territory on what is now called Vancouver Island in so-called Canada. It was one of the first colonies on the west coast here, all by itself, the colony of Vancouver Island. on behalf of the British Crown. And my father's side is from Saitnich territory, also on the island, with all of our families spreading across the Salish Sea, as well over to the mainland. And yeah, I'm really grateful to be invited to this space to share my experience, as well as to contribute to any type of conversation that we can learn together, and ideally have some concrete vision that we would like to have for what solutions are available already and what things we can bring forward from our dreams, and really just echoing the type of effort that the fellow panelists have shared in making this for our communities, for our families, and for the folks that are going to come after us. And for me personally, I am just like a Native person who has been living on my homelands and pretty much denying the criminal justice system the opportunity to deliver justice. I believe that our Indigenous laws, our Indigenous governance, and our ways of being can be fully embodied and practiced in a way that upholds who we are every single day. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in to see how today goes. And thank you very much. And we'll hopefully get into the nitty-gritty if our panelists are interested in doing that, but also to maybe connect with folks after.
Thank you, Katie, Danielle, Tomas, and Ariel for those introductions. I'm really excited for this conversation today. I had worked with Katie at Needle, the Indigenous Food Systems Initiative in Victoria, BC, and I had the pleasure of meeting Danielle and Tomas at the United Nations Conference on Biodiversity last December in Montreal. And then I've been working alongside Ariel at Indigenous Climate Action since the summer. And so I'm super stoked to be joined by some legacy projects in climate justice and climate action. And I think to get us started, I can ask Danielle, like, how did you get into this line of work? How did you, find yourself in these spaces and even ending up here today?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Willow. I grew up on my homelands on the Hoopa Reservation in what's now known as Northern California. And we are a very river-based community. Our homelands are very rural. We kind of got late contact compared to, some of our relatives in the States. And so our home is, it's just a very unique place. It's just revolves around the water and the people. Our population's like 2,000, little res in the middle of the mountains. And so growing up, of course, we faced all of the hardships that reservation life unfortunately does come with for a lot of our young people, but we had this place that kept us really safe and gave us a place to call home, and that was really important. And I grew up kind of in a family who recognized the danger that our homes were in because of the system that the United States does have, and the history of water, of stealing from us our water, our people, our lands. And so people were recognizing all of these bad things that were happening. And actually, the year my mom was pregnant with me, we had the largest fish kill our community has ever faced. And about 60% of both juvenile and adult salmon kind of just died overnight and washed up on the banks. And everyone in our community was devastated because that was our main food source. It was something we were told we were supposed to take care of. And so it was kind of just like, if this is happening to our relatives in the water, what's going to happen to us? And so that actually the next year, the fight for Klamath dam removal really started in a legal sense. That was something, our people had known that these things were really bad from the get-go. But after that fish kill was when, we started using policy and all of these things to actually fight against the system that we're in to kind of protect ourselves in our home. And 21 years later in 2023, the Klamath Dam removal is happening. 1 out of 4 dams is out. It's the largest river restoration project in the world. And that's how I came into this, was kind of just watching that movement my whole life of, like being a baby and then being a toddler and having all these it was like just a normal thing to drive 5 hours down to the state capitol to go to protests or water board hearings. It was just a part of our life growing up, recognizing that it's our job to kind of step into these places and make sure that our kids do have these things because someone did that for us. And so, yeah, I grew up at those protests, and I grew up, saying water back, land back, like doing all these things. And then I started learning more about policy and have been able to kind of learn more about advocacy in that sense. But really, it just comes from a place of community, like growing up in a place that's just too special to not try and protect. And that kind of led me to where I'm at now. I'm on the board for an international river kind of serving organization called Rios to Rivers, where I'm able to connect with Indigenous youth from a lot of different river basins who are either being affected by hydro projects or, celebrating the removal of hydro projects or, actively fighting against huge hydro projects that are going to destroy their homelands. And so we get to, provide them with resources, give them support to actually step into these things and stop big things like, Klamath Dam removal that puts people's homelands underwater and kills all of our salmon and kind of just destroys our way of life. And so that's where kind of I'm at right now. And that's definitely, what brought me into this work, was just seeing all the amazing people in my community fight for something like that is so essential to our life, and recognizing that the people who have like the decision-making power in this country are not going to fight for the things that we fight for unless we make them. And so that's kind of, just somewhere that I've stepped into. And I'm able to do it I work predominantly with Native youth. So that's kind of how I'm able to sustain myself in this work, is just like recognizing that we have this whole entire generation of change makers like coming next, like ready to step into these places and take the power back. So I'm excited for that. And that's where I kind of do most of my work.
Nice. Thank you, Danielle. That's incredible. I feel like the largest river restoration project on Earth, and it's amazing that it's well underway. Like in the midst of this climate crisis and all of these massive, like 1 in 1,000-year weather events that we're experiencing, like things like this river restoration and this rematriation of the land, like gives the rest of us hope. And our communities are able to learn from communities like yours, like doing the damn thing. And yeah, I'm really stoked that you're here to talk about that, and also that you come from this generational resistance to this ongoing colonization on your lands. Colonization really thrives when we're all siloed and in these nuclear families, but the resistance and the reclamation requires this intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And so I will pass this on to Tomas. How did you get into this line of work?
Yeah. So I just realized I didn't do the best job of introducing myself. I'm going to start over if that's okay. My name is Tomas Lopez Jr. I identify as Chicano. I am Lakota, Otomi, Tarasco. I also honor my Mexican and American side as well. So that's why I carry the identity Chicano, for those of you who did not know what that means. I am one of many grandchildren of Chief of Chiefs Leonard Crodog Sr. My mother is Waterwoman Sharon Dominguez, and my father is Sundance Chief Tomas Lopez Sr. Sorry about that. So how did I get into this work? Well, it wasn't really work to me growing up. I really didn't know that people got paid to do things like this, to be honest. It was kind of just what we did. I grew up very closely to the old American Indian movement folks. My grandfather, Leonard Crodog, was the spiritual leader of the American Indian movement. I grew up very closely to the Chicano movement as well. And at many points throughout history of the two movements, they intersected, which is where you find a lot of people like me who come out of that those intersections. So growing up, fighting for our communities was just kind of a part of life. It really wasn't like something that like you like chose to do. Like we had to do it, right? Because if we didn't do it, like they just erased us. And I feel like growing up, the erasure, the forced assimilation was something that always was very heavy on me. And I could feel it everywhere that I went. And I heard about the indigenous resistance at home, but when I went out into the world, the two worlds and the two teachings didn't quite connect. And so I got older. I went to college. I did what the Western world considers to be the right thing, right? I got out of college, and when I got out of college, I couldn't find a job. I was working at American Apparel, like just like selling pointless shit to people. And that's when I started to hear a lot of my cousins and my aunties and uncles were actually going up to Standing Rock to make a stand against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I had also heard about these young people who were like my age and younger who were running from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. to hand deliver at the time President Obama like a certain number of letters in opposition towards the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was mind blown by this. And I was really impressed that like all of these young people were making this call for other young people to go there. So I packed up a car full of supplies. I went up to Standing Rock, and what was supposed to just be like a little 4-day trip, I ended up being there for like 3 months. And I became really close with all of the other, they weren't just Lakota kids at that point. They were young people from several different indigenous nations who were really leading the youth-led like aspect of what happened on the ground in Standing Rock. And that was with the International Indigenous Youth Council. From there, I've done several different things, and now I really just focus on ultimately creating visibility, not only for myself, but for other young, queer, Indigenous people who are fighting to make their mark on the world as well. I see one of the biggest things that hinders us is the lack of visibility historically in mainstream media, in academia, in the scientific world. I think that that is one of the main problems that we face as Indigenous people, is just the fact that our assimilation was forced and our erasure is intentional. So everything that I do is through that lens and to fight that. And I've found that the best way for me to inspire change in people is not necessarily through your typical fight, but actually through comedy, through culture, through history, and through community organizing. So yeah, that's how I got to where I'm at now. And I will pass it to, or do I pass it or do I give it back to you, Willow?
I can pass it off after. Yeah, thank you, Tomas. Yeah, I feel like I'm always hesitant to implore the words activist or advocate for Indigenous people defending their lands, because like we are nature defending itself. And I'm really grateful that you spoke to the youth leadership and how important that is, and also how integral it is for like Two-Spirit and like queer Indigenous folks to also be in positions of leadership in these climate responses. It's so essential. And I think with queerness and all of our Two-Spirit fams, like they show us other ways to exist, and they show us that it does not have to be this way. And so, yeah, thank you, Tomas, for speaking to the youth leadership and as well as being Two-Spirit. Yeah, I'll pass this on to Ariel if you want to let me know how you got into this work.
You know, it's really interesting to just sort of hear some of the younger folks. Like, I am middle-aged. It's been a very interesting journey for myself into this work, but my story is essentially the same. My instead of my grandfather being a part of the American Indian movement, it was my parents. And so my parents met via the American Indian movement. They were at Wounded Knee in 1973, the Alcatraz, all the sort of key moments. And my family were activists, but I really appreciate that this is still part of our shared history and journey into this work. But I think to contextualize it just a little bit more is that when I started to come into this on my own was my own experiences in recognizing or realizing this disconnect from society at large, predominantly non-Indigenous society, but these value systems that drove our economies and our political. I have no idea. Can you hear me? Am I back?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I'll try my camera again. I live out in the country and like I don't live in the city, I live rurally, and so my internet is not always amazing. Anyways, what I was saying is that I studied political economy, and within that work, really learning about how colonial governments built their political power through economic power, which was largely driven from the stolen lands and resources of Indigenous peoples. At the time, I was also working for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. And I was working on specific land claims and treaty land entitlement. Is a very technical term, but I basically worked on researching breaches of treaty related to land. I think you all can draw these conclusions. Essentially, most of the land claims were about lands being appropriated for industrial development. Hydro, electrical lines, train systems, farming land, oil and gas, so on and so forth. And because I came from a politically active family where I make jokes about how because I was raised this way. I make jokes that arts and crafts growing up were coming up with chants for protests and making placard signs for rallies. And so with this political background, activist background, and then my academic background and my experiences in land claims, I started to see how the structures that we were all living within were built upon this premise of devaluing and demonizing Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And this became extra important for me as I started to look deeper into the climate movement. Because as we looked at the climate movement, one of the other pieces that I started to see, I'm frozen again. No, I'm here. Okay. One of the other things I started to see was that there was this focus on continuing to adopt this system that was just about colonial values of money and land. And we still get stuck in this conversation that the solutions to the climate crisis have to be balanced with the economy, as if the economy is the only thing that matters. And the economic systems that we live in are built upon a structure that devalues, demonizes Indigenous ways of being. So if we are actually going to move towards a transformative justice framework, then we have to look at challenging not just the political and economic systems we live in, but we also have to be challenging what we accept as solutions and alternatives to the crisis that we're in. And when I looked at my history of land claims and seeing how we were writing these land claims that we were submitting to Canada, where Canada was the judge, jury, and executor, and determining whether or not they violated their own laws, it just felt like a broken system. And it felt like we were trying to still force these assimilation into colonial values and ideologies, not just within land claim systems, but across all forms. And then as I stepped into the environmental and climate movement, what I saw was this incredible power that Indigenous resistance to colonial systems and structures was actually a climate solution. And I've had a lot of people say, what do you mean by that? And Indigenous Climate Action helped to release a report with the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International called Indigenous Resistance to Carbon. And in this report, it looks at how Indigenous land defense, Standing Rock, the resistance to Site C, the resistance to the expansion of the oil sands, the Bakken oil field, the refineries in the South, in the United States, all of these have amounted to carbon being left in the ground and less carbon being released from these sources. You take this Indigenous resistance to carbon and then you match it with the fact that Indigenous peoples are also stewarding and protecting their land and building are utilizing Indigenous knowledge systems to build and strengthen conservation of biological diversity to the point that 80% of the world's biodiversity exists within Indigenous lands and territories. And you start to see how not only are Indigenous peoples systems and our rights frameworks critical to building solutions to the climate crisis, we're not operating within a commodification of those solutions. We're not saying, pay me to be a conservation officer. We're doing it out of the moral values of who we are as Indigenous peoples, embodying those same values that our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents have fought for through the American Indian movement, through challenging treaty processes, and for fighting for what is left of our lands and territories in these countries, in our countries and our homelands. And when we're embodying those moral responsibilities as Indigenous peoples, and then trying to build alternative solutions, we start to fracture and crack those frameworks of colonial systems and economic systems of predatory capitalism and move towards systems that are governed by natural law, by Indigenous values, by our knowledge systems, and ultimately through our relationships from the places where we come from. And one of the really cool things that I've learned over my years working in these movements in the international space is they're starting to look at like how non-commodified solutions by Indigenous peoples actually don't just protect the lands and territories, they actually increase the capacities of our lands and territories to sequester more carbon. So when a community has intact language, intact cultural practices, intact forms of self-governance and sovereignty, that they're more likely to have not just localized economies and quality of life, but their lands and territories are kept in better and more pristine states. And those lands and territories have an exponentially higher rate of return on carbon sequestration. And again, we've been doing this since time immemorial because it is about those relationships with those places. We are not asking to be paid for it. And when we talk about climate finance right now in the international scope, we also have to recognize that this doesn't mean that we should not receive reparations to the harms. This does not mean that we don't want to operate and benefit and receive resources for the contributions that we've made, because we absolutely should, because we bear the largest and most harsh consequences of the climate crisis, and we have been left out of the economic frameworks and the land governance frameworks that have caused this, and we've been left out of the economic development solutions to solve this crisis. So for myself, I've seen how my own community, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, has tried to take ourselves out of this forced economic system of oil and gas in the Alberta tar sands and really tried to drive into an Indigenous valued system of solutions. That includes building the largest off-grid solar farm, a hydroponic garden system in our community so we can have fresh green vegetables. We have developed community garden plots. We have developed language revitalization and cultural revitalization as part of those practices, having more community-based activities to bring people into land-based practices. All of this is not only create localized economies, but to further safeguard our lands and territories for future generations and contribute to building climate solutions. There is so much to be learned from our communities and the way in which we challenge the status quo of what energy we need to be utilizing, what systems we need to be utilizing and governing ourselves from a colonial perspective, and what economic systems we need to be participating in. I think we absolutely have so much to learn from the newer generations that are coming up with even more diverse solutions. And we can't reduce the climate solutions discussion to just changing one energy system to another. It is much more broad and much more diverse, and it cannot be continued to be contained within an economic framework. We have to move to these real solutions that are creating real reduction in emissions, real reduction on reliance on dirty energy systems, and building new economic frameworks and quality of life for those that have faced some of the most severe impacts of the climate crisis. And I see it time and time and time again. It starts with resisting colonial systems, and then it moves on to building up the capacities of our Indigenous communities to see themselves as valuable outside of those colonial structures, and then driving those traditional Indigenous values and governance and relationships to build the future that doesn't just benefit our communities, but benefits the entire world at large. I'm so excited to be on this panel and hear about these projects that you all are doing. And just know that we've been doing this work for so long, and you are literally the vision of our ancestors. And I'm so excited for this.
Ariel, I feel like you just blew the top off the whole operation in that response. That was incredible. Yeah, and that last point that you mentioned about like finding your value outside of capitalism and colonization, is such an important one, because it was capitalism and colonization that introduced scarcity and lack to us. You know, before these systems came on and displaced us quite violently, we were the most abundant people on earth. You know, we were abundant in the land, we were abundant in ceremony, we were abundant in community. And so I really appreciate you saying that we need to find our value outside of these systems, and as well as touching on the Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon report by the Indigenous Environmental Network. It was the first time that I had seen this kind of data like quantified in these ways, and to actually have numbers that you can walk away from and understanding the impacts and the gravity of Indigenous resistance against oil and gas projects and against carbon. You know, like in with these resistances across Turtle Island, like Indigenous people delayed or stopped the emissions equivalent to 1/4 of the annual emissions of Canada and the US. And so it's real, you know, and we don't need to back up our understandings of life and the power that we hold in these like Western understandings of science, but it does help, you know, and it's colonization that forced us to walk in these worlds, in both worlds of our culture and colonization. I will pass this on to Katie. How did you get into this work?
Yeah, funny. I'm trying to understand what the work is like every day. I'm trying to meet the needs of my own family, of relatives that are on the land, that are facing the imminent threat of settler occupation and the spread of urban development where I live, where the continued displacement of people is just very obvious. And, you know, speaking to like many of the things that have been brought up already of like how you got here, and then Ariel, you're just tying in everything to like what's on your heart and like what's on your mind always. And I think bringing into this space like some memories or some reflections, you know, I grew up around an artist and an educator, as well as many aunties, and I think that has kept me grounded as a child, as someone who moved through like a lot of choices that I would not make again as an adult, through my time as a young youth and teenager. And I think something that defined a lot of that time was tokenization, and a lot of using my interest, my drive, and like my kindness for the Colonial project that is Victoria, or that is British Columbia. And I think youth are targeted a lot of the time through opportunities, through school, through many state sanctioned structures that push youth into a direction, particularly Indigenous youth, to have this program mindset, to have this mindset of how change or how justice or environmentalism or whatever it is can be achieved, and within these boxes then consumes any creativity or outlying like interests of how everything is connected. And just personally, I was quite divided as a young person of my cultural obligations and my understanding of a reality of responsibility as a Native person from here, as well as an easy way out of those responsibilities is to belong in colonial society. You're given a lot of money, you're given a voice, you're giving all these spaces, which I find interesting now as an older person to reflect on, and people that perhaps continued on those avenues or entered into them into a time where it is more popular to be Indigenous in spaces where it is commodified to be Indigenous. And so then when you talk about it with the climate crisis or environmentalism, it's actually been quite a lot of my experience is the damage that is done through, you know, you could say neo-colonialism, you can say, you know, it's the same colonialism, however you want to put it. But just as a Native person trying to work through, like, you know, Willow and I have these conversations, we have these conversations as peers and as young people, how to balance trying to do work, whether it's a paid job or, you know, your family work, your cultural work, whatever this work is, while also trying to bring forward like yourself in all forms, and trying to deal with like the experiences of genocide and trauma and harm that comes along with that. And I think for myself to be fully myself and to use my name to feel confident as a person who can deny colonial legal systems on my homelands, it really comes from that strength of, you know, recalling lessons that I've learned as a child, and bringing forward that sense of patience, that sense of strength that comes from within. And so for myself, I really base a lot of my work in relationships with people who are also, you know, confident from within and have stories from different times of colonialism where I'm from, as well as visiting other people in different territories to learn about those experiences under the Indian Act in Canada, which is typically where I spend a lot of my time trying to tease out tactics and approaches to be able to bring forward a lot of those conversations and actions with Native people who we all are affected by, in this call, the United States or Canada, with different legislation with, where we live, if people recall the white paper, and the constitutional train and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, all of these things during that time, I'm really looking to see these shifts for Canada and the type of language that is used to make Native people feel more comfortable being inside Canada and forgetting that the sovereignty that we're talking about, the things that we're calling for and want to relate to that land, come back to outside of everything that is Canada. And so when I come into work around climate justice or land defense or anything like that, it really comes back to myself and the people that I'm mentored by, of trying so hard to uphold and really nurture the type of structures as Indigenous people that we can uphold while all of this other work needs to be done. For instance, of if it is how we're building our houses, where we're getting our energy from, and what do we do with settler people who are occupying our territory with either these massive destructive projects or with cities or settler towns themselves. And so for me, I really abandoned an identity that was welcomed by the Canadian state, that was welcomed by a colonial society, and just started living as myself and with my name and with the belief in all of those ancestral structures that are still here. We're just picking them up and we're nurturing them. And to me, that is the basis of a lot of that work, and it's introduced in all of the collaborative projects. Or I mean, I could talk about other things, like Willow, feel free to ask more, but I hope that was helpful into some of that insight. And none of us are perfect. Like, I think romanticizing like who we are is like really hard, at least for me, where I'm constantly trying to learn lessons from previous decisions or generations to then how are we moving into a future, and how do we not replicate the same things that we're battling now. For instance, which is the BC Modern Treaty process, which, funny enough, with two other young people, Takaya Blaney and Aya Clapis, at a large UN delegation, we talked about how the BC Treaty process is contributing to the climate crisis where we live and the theft of land for Native people. And so I think it is really important to use that type of language now, where we're shifting the conversation and upholding who we are in those ways. So maybe I'll leave it there, but thanks for the question, Willow.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. That was an incredible response. Yeah, so many thoughts. I feel like these settler states of Canada and the United States, like, they're very new, and our ancestors knew a time and a land before Canada and before the United States, and because of this collective awareness and these resistances in these lifetimes, like, our descendants will know these lands again outside of Canada and outside of the United States. And also, to kind of expand on what Katie was talking about with the white paper and the Indian Act, like, we've seen some incredibly racist legislature passed, like, in our lifetimes, like, not that long ago. And like, we also have to remember who passed the 1969 white paper, is Pierre Trudeau. And that name might sound familiar because that's the father of Canada's prime minister, one of the most racist people to ever set foot in the Canadian government, raised the person who's leading us right now. And Yeah, and I think that like tokenization and colonization as well that Katie spoke to is so important, because people are starting to turn to Indigenous people, but they're not actually allowing them a seat at the table sometimes, you know? And if we still have this commodification of our ways of being and our understandings of life in this climate response, like it is still a form of extraction, you know? And it's still a way that like they're taking stuff from us, they're taking our knowledge and our wisdom, you know, of the land. um yeah, and yeah, awesome responses, guys. I feel like there have been some really cool like threads of continuity that have linked us, you know, north and south of the medicine line. Like we have, you know, the descendants of like the American Indian movement with Tomas and Ariel, and as well as these like generational resistances in projects in communities like Katie and Danielle. And so for the next question, we can start with Tomas. If you want to, do you have, what are your personal criteria or like frameworks for like what a real solution is, and like whether that's enacted by community, by government, or industry even, but what is a real solution to you?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I guess there's kind of I have two answers here. Um, One is like, what do actual solutions look like? I think the biggest thing that I've heard talked about, and that is just really resonating in my personal life, and also just I think the world, is the idea that we really need to challenge the systems that have been given to us. I really do. My biggest fear is that, as radical as our generations are, that we will fall into the same traps as the generation before us. And I see it happening every single day, with a lot of these like youth-led organizations that are kind of going down this like non-profit industrial complex, like corporately structured like route. And I don't bring this up to say that like one is right and one is wrong, but what I do believe is the problem is that we walk into these structures without remembering that we have to constantly challenge them. Yes, you can use these tools, but if you just use them in the same ways that they've been used generation and generation, you are going to instill the same harm that was instilled onto you. And it happens without you even realizing it. Like it's something I'm really facing right now, even with organizations that I've been a part of in the past, is looking up and all of a sudden you're this corporate entity, clocking in and out, and with benefits and an HR department, so that you can go talk to somebody that you work with every single. It doesn't make any sense, and it happens without you even realizing. You look down and you look up, and you're a corporation, and the harms that you fought so hard to prevent from happening are now being used not only against you, but against the people that you've brought into the picture and into the situation. And so I believe that when we identify these solutions, we have to remember that our solutions must constantly be challenging the norm, but also itself. Because what I've also seen is that sometimes, especially when it comes to like legislative solutions, we make these solutions that are made for the moment. And we don't look at the long-term impact of what these solutions are actually going to do and what they're going to have. For example, I can't remember it, with the degradable cups and the degradable plates and stuff. Like, yes, they're degradable, but what do they degrade into? Like, what is left over? Like, is whatever it degrades into, is that actually good for the earth? Like, or is it just degrading so that we can't see it? Like, what is the true solution there? And so that goes back to, like, to me again, like, how do we create solutions that are not only going to like challenge the norm, but also challenge themselves over the long course of time as well. And then another solution that I really believe is like, this is like what I believe a solution to a lot of our issues are, is understanding that there really were no colonial borders at all at one point. And at one point in time, from Alaska to La Tierra de Fuego, we were aware of who we were. We weren't one people. Okay, I'm not saying that we were one giant indigenous nation. No, we were a nation of empires and nations, but we knew who each other were. We knew the traditional pathways to get to the next village. And that was actually how we were able to communicate with each other. It's how we told each other about war, about famine, about sicknesses. We would send messages, and we had these ancient trade routes that still exist, I'm sure, to these days, but have been severed. They've been forgotten because of these colonial borders. And one of the biggest things that I love to talk about is like expanding people's idea of what a Native American is. You know, I feel like people think that Native Americans are only like north of the Mexican-American border, when the truth is that like the Americas expand from like north to south. It's like two continents, three if you consider Central America continent, which I do. So yeah, like I think that it's really important to like really begin to establish those traditional routes, and maybe they're not going to look like physical roads, but like it's important for our generation to re-establish what it means to be a Native American, and like make sure that our Indigenous sisters and brothers and siblings to the global South are being included in all of these things as well. Because just even from my time, I spent a week in Mexico a couple weeks ago, and just what I even learned from like what the government is doing there with indigenous peoples, and how they are ultimately like for the first time in a long time, they're a government that is really supportive of like the natives, and really supportive of like restoring Mexico back to a point where it is actually working and upholding native rights and native way of life. And so I think that as we continue doing this work, like one solution I really do believe is, as Native people, like bringing back those ways of like reconnecting ourselves, and ensuring that that we not only learn from each other, but that we're helping each other with these long-term solutions. Because I feel like borders are a really big issue in what we're talking about. Just to give you an example, so I was born and raised in Commerce City. Commerce City is probably what I would say is like the center of the climate crisis in this like Southwest, and people don't even know about it. It's one of the largest oil refineries in the US, and it actually takes and refines all of the tar sands that come from Canada. And I didn't even know that they did this my whole life. I actually didn't even realize that it was what it was until I came back from Standing Rock. And I found out that like what I thought was like a power plant, which wouldn't be any better. I don't know why that caused me any less alarm. But like what I thought was a power plant was actually an oil refinery. And it was like one of the endpoints for a pipeline that's similar to the Dakota Access Pipeline. So like what I realized was that people in Commerce City, we all get affected, but people in Denver, there's no connection to any of their health issues to the Suncor refinery, because the Suncor refinery isn't in Denver. It's in Commerce City, the city right next to it. And of course, as all of you know, toxic chemicals stop it at like community lines. So I realized that like people, even in our own borders, your own local borders, are taking those borders and they're making them real. So in their heads, what's poisoning the neighborhood next to them isn't poisoning my neighborhood because it stops at the county line. So realizing that like these borders are a huge problem in the issues that we're trying to solve, and understanding that like these issues are not going to stop at a border. they're going to affect you. They're like, cancer doesn't care if you're American. It doesn't care if you're from Canada. It doesn't care if you're from Denver, if you're from Mexico. It's going to affect you, period. And if these chemicals are following the wind channels, if these chemicals are going into the rivers, if these chemicals are infecting the earth, which grows our food, and then gets sent on a mass scale to all of these different places, okay, well then this problem that is affecting Commerce City, this problem that is affecting Standing Rock, this problem that is affecting, Atlanta, is no longer just affecting these places. It has now become a national, a global problem because of how connected we truly are. So one of my main solutions to a lot of the problems that we see is acknowledging that these borders that we have are causing some of the biggest issues that we're talking about. They're causing the siloing that Willow was talking about when we first introduced ourselves.
Okay, bars, Tomas. That was awesome. Yeah, no, the borders, and like they're incredibly fake, and they're enforced by policy and police, and it just drives that separation so deep. And like I just think of all of the communities all along the medicine line that were totally split by the creation of the Canada-US border, and like the US-Mexico border as well. We had communities pretty much like split down the middle in a lot of places, and told to go one place or another, and totally prohibiting us from just moving across the lands in the ways that we always have. And I think what I was thinking about while Tomas was speaking about sovereignty was, I think a key feature of sovereignty is the ability to uphold and acknowledge and respect the sovereigns around you, and I think I can argue that like Canada and the United States are not sovereign nations because they do not uphold and uplift or recognize other sovereign nations or beings outside of their administrations at the provincial and state and federal levels, and yeah, and I think also with like Tomas coming from Commerce City in Colorado and speaking to the Alberta tar sands, and how like Tomas lives in a place that is refining the oil and the crude products that are coming from Alberta, which the Alberta tar sands are the largest extractive project on planet Earth. They are quite literally like larger than the state of Florida in the United States. And unfortunately, oil and gas is something that links a lot of these countries that either import or export. And it was actually like the oil crisis that happened in the late 70s that led to a massive upheaval and fortification of the Alberta tar sands to have access to more of a local oil and gas base, as opposed to this need to import it from other countries like Chile or other countries like that. I will pass this on to Katie. What are your frameworks or like personal criteria for real solutions?
Frameworks or personal criteria. Also, thank you to my translator. I appreciate your help through this. I think I'm going to just give an example because I think for myself, as someone who comes from, I mean, if I'm just building off of what Tomas was saying earlier, the interconnectedness of and the communication of Native people, I think really highlights the complexity of our social networks throughout all of our time of living as Native people, and our social networks in relation to the land, in relation to beings that are not human. Those types of communication are so valuable to our understanding of the creation of life, the way we behave as people, the laws that we abide by to ensure that we understand our place in the world. And so a criteria or framework really just, for me, comes back to what we could maybe say in English, which is place-based learning or place-based laws, which alternatively in all of our language would just be our way of life, our culture, our laws, who we are at our core as Pamok, as Kuas, like all of these ways that build us up in our structures, our legal orders as Indigenous people, they're not gone. And I think when we try to balance solutions within frameworks that are not our own, it can leave behind many of the significant aspects of who we are as Indigenous people. And similarly, the right or wrong is a really hard binary to work in, and I don't think it's as helpful as it is to have communities or groups of people come to these understandings together to say this is right and this is wrong. I think I personally have to work with a lot of contradictions and a lot of pain in certain organizing or nation building or solution research in all ways, because the belief in ourselves, the belief in our spirituality, the belief in these laws is fading. And I mean, that has to do with a lot of impacts like missionaries and religions that have been brought to our lands for the explicit purpose of trying to humanize savages, trying to humanize Native people from the view of an Anglo-Saxon, like a white group of people, to make Natives civilized. And I think the framework or the criteria, again, I have a lot of gratitude for the people that have helped mentor me and guide me in many conversations of what can we do to not feel so helpless, or to feel that we all have something to contribute. And it always just comes back to the stories of where we come from, or the stories of where we're going. And I think that's what the right or wrong is. I think there's many Native people, and I've learned this through my relationships with Native people from across different territories over the years, is that we don't all have everything. We don't all have everything that we need to have a future together, but we all have pieces, or we all have a part also to play in the larger framework or the larger system, which again, I bring it back to what Tomas is saying, is that interconnected relationship, because even though we didn't have the same culture, the same way of being, way of life in like our day-to-day, because of our climate, because of our relatives, all of these things that impact who we are. However, we do have the foundational piece which connects us is the land, and our very strict understanding and practice of what it means to be Native. And I think when we're coming to this point in colonialism where Indigenous identity is given to us by the government, or given to us by some outside body, or an Indian band system, which is what is in Canada, or maybe a tribe affiliation that's in the US, those designated, recognized bodies by states like Canada or the US continue to box us in, continue to separate us from our spiritual relationship, because those bodies, those governing bodies, do not allow us to be spiritual, do not allow us to be savage in the ways that we are and always will be, if that's, as Native people, what we continue to believe in. And so these frameworks or the criteria for solutions, you could say it's critical thinking, you could say it's systems thinking. There's so many ways to describe how to build relationships or how to build a future. And I think, again, as Native people, it's so important for us not to try to compare one another and to try to compete as who's going to be the most Indigenous or who's going to be the most successful. And I think that's what colonialism really has done, is that they've taken away our ability to communicate with one another, because it's English that we're communicating with, or it's through money, or it's through universities or wherever, the government. And so an example of home is the continued and illegal process of land claims and land settlements, which are being made through illegal governing bodies of the Indian Act ban systems. And for me, why that is so integral is because it is turning people who, where I come from, this most recently this summer, where a ban system is trying to infiltrate just as much as a municipality, a city, a province, or a state into the family structure of Indigenous people. And it's really difficult to even have family functions or family structure when sexualized violence, the displacement of families, so many things have interrupted who we are in our entirety of Indigenous people. And so these governance structures or political structures, whatever it is, are trying to completely eliminate us while saying that that's who we are as Indigenous people, to label us as a number, as this is our prescribed identity. And you see that in many, many lands where state structures and the assimilation of people is the target. So for me, I have a really hard time even collaborating on solutions that can't bring our laws forward. And I think it's to the detriment of who we are as Native people to forget. And I think it's really important to me. And it doesn't mean that we can't have new or creative ways of bringing forward or practicing those laws. But I do think it is being co-opted, especially where we live in British Columbia, where the British Columbia government, can recognize hereditary leadership, which is outside of band councils, at its convenience, because it's still relying on the state or for a colonial government to recognize Indigenous people. So that's really hard for me. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I feel like it was such an important point about like how these states of like Canada and the US recognize personhood. And I think a lot of the time, like with these like Indigenous legal systems or, child welfare and healthcare being taken under the realm of Indigenous folks and communities, a lot of the time that's only granted when our systems mirror theirs, and it's kind of like just hanging the bait for us at the end of the stick and say, you can have this, you can be sovereign if you look like us, and if you act like us. And I think to be sovereign is to just decide that for yourself, ultimately. And I will pass this on to Ariel if you want to talk about some personal criteria or frameworks about real solutions.
I think the context of real solutions, I think Katie really really summarized and really gave a lot of weight to there's no right or wrong. I think if we're talking about the context of real non-commodified solutions, it creates that distinguishing, because there are real solutions that move us closer towards transformative change and moving the needle more towards a justice framework. And then there are climate solutions that embed us deeper into the status quo of colonial capitalism and governance systems and like values. And so when we are having this conversation around Indigenous solutions to the climate crisis and what real solutions are, we have to find ways to bring in that context of how do we begin to build solutions that are not constantly pegged and valued against their commodification, how they continue to uphold colonial capitalism. A bulk of the conversations within the UN FCCC, like the big UN climate conferences spaces, is really continues to be reduced to an economic discussion. And while I understand we live in capitalism, we do. We all live and exist within a colonial capitalist system and structure. And of course, you're going to see people continue to try to hold that and secure it and make sure that it continues, because it's all we know. It's all most non-Indigenous peoples know. And the beauty of our Indigenous ways of being is that our intergenerational knowledge transference allows us to hold the stories and the knowledge of pre-colonial systems, whether those are systems of governance, systems of economies, systems of land management, systems of relational ways of being and interconnectedness with the natural world. And that allows us a framework of broader imagination beyond the existing scope of colonial frameworks. And I love that. I love that. And so I always say this, it's not like we just need to be like, oh, we can't talk about windmills and micro hydro and geothermal and solar power. Like, it's not that those don't hold value. They can hold value. They absolutely can hold value, but they hold a lot of value if we continue to just think about solutions within a colonial framework. And when we expand the framework to broaden its understanding of value into a non-commodified capitalist system, into an Indigenous value system, we can start to see that there are more options, that there is a broader sense of belonging in a solutions framework. One of the biggest challenges that we're experiencing within the international community is this forced perception that the only way a solution can hold value is if it has an economic dollar amount attached to it. So we can only talk about nature-based solutions. That's what they're calling them, which is just a co-optation of Indigenous resistance to the colonial structures, where we've said we need to be listening to nature and listening to natural law to guide the solutions to the climate crisis. So they've co-opted that because it started to gain a lot of traction and have a lot of merit from a scientific perspective. And they were just like, well, we can't have that unless we can add a dollar amount to it. So now they're trying to convince Indigenous communities that if you want to participate in the climate discourse, climate solutions discourse, you need to be telling us why this is important to our economy. You need to tell us how your land conservation can be capitalized on. Can we calculate the amount of carbon that your language preservation contributes, and then we can suddenly make it valuable to an investor? The problem is these investors that they're trying to push on our communities to invest in cultural and language and knowledge transference are the same people that want to continue to see business as usual. They want to be able to continue their oil and gas projects. They want to be able to continue the projects. They want to be able to continue to do these things by investing in safeguarding one place while destroying in another. Sacrifice zones. So we can't be a part of solutions that are just searching to find the commodification. How do we buy and sell and trade and create value to this? because our systems were never created under this commodification zone. Tom Goldtooth often says that we have, like, that there is this desire to commodify the air. We're commodifying the GHGs in the atmosphere and how much a tree can sequester from the air, the GHGs. And what that does is it reduces the crisis to this mathematical equation as opposed to a human relational and life relational challenge. So real solutions need to be rooted in these interconnected relationships that we have with the natural world, with our river systems, with our resources, and like on the land. I think like one of the really interesting things that I've been really struggling with lately is we say things like dirty fossil fuels and oil is evil. And I understand the sentiment, because it is the ways in which we've perverted and contorted and twisted a natural part of the earth to burn and to create chaos in the world. It has become evil, but it's actually an element of this planet. It's a part of this finite ecosystem. And we also have to recognize and reconcile that if we want to be a part of solutions, we have to learn how to love all parts of the earth, including the coal and the gas and the oil. And we have to learn to love it so that we don't abuse it, so that we don't like turn it into something that is for us to make us stronger and more powerful and all of the things. Our communities looked at ways to work with the ecosystem. Like, let's go back. Let's talk about bison for a second. The bison was keystone. They talked about it as the keystone species in North America for Indigenous peoples. I listened to a beautiful TED Talk, and I can't remember her name right now. She was a Navajo or Dene woman from Navajo Nation down south. And she said, I want to challenge this idea that the buffalo were a keystone species. She's like, Indigenous peoples were the keystone species. We were the ones that managed the buffalo. And by managing the buffalo, we became the keystone. And by managing the buffalo, we managed the lands. By managing the lands, we managed the waterways and the plants and the berries. The entire ecosystem of North America pre-contact was based on essentially a giant permaculture project that looked at how we could, migrate and plant certain animals and plant species in different locations to support our thriving communities. That is an interrelationship-based system that created economies of trade, economies of food, economies of governance. Political economic structures were driven by the roles and responsibilities we held in managing vast territories and ecosystems and the resources that they created. And we forget that these economic trade routes existed through the Americas. And thank you so much, Tomas, about the fact that Indigenous peoples, our Native Americans, are not just in North America. Our ancestors traded all the way from the Arctic down into South America. And my own people, Dene people and Dene people, the history of my own people is from the Arctic to Mexico. And there are stories that our people traveled even further south. These trade routes and economic systems that we created not only bolstered our capacities to thrive on this continent, but they also created our understanding of how to navigate and work in relationship with different ecosystems. We have to have solutions that are driven by our interrelationships with the places where we come from. And who are the best people to determine what those solutions are? Those that have lived in relationship with those places for the longest amount of time. We talk about science needs to be the metric for solutions within the international scope. So let's look at the definition of science. Science is about observation and studying a subject, and then drawing conclusions from observing. And you look at Indigenous peoples, we have been observing and drawing conclusions over our lands and territories for thousands and thousands of years. We are the best ecologists. the best hydrologists, the best conservationists, the best scientists in the region. And yet our knowledge and our systems and structures are constantly devalued into being anecdotal evidence because we don't abide by colonial empirical data collection and storage and collation. And I think that this is where we need to really be shifting. And a lot of folks are like, okay, well, then how do we hold Indigenous knowledge to drive real solutions? And I always go back to this really, really amazing thing that happened in my community. So in 2012, the government was working on the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. And within that, they were working on the surface water quantity framework, quantity and quality framework. So they're looking at the flow of the river system and determining like what they need to maintain it. And this is really important because I come from an oil sands extraction zone. And so of course the oil and gas companies have a huge hand in this. They're like, we need to be able to operate. And they hired all these ecologists, hydrologists, and biologists, the best in the world, according to Alberta, to come in and study the region and determine what was necessary for what they called an ecological base flow. The base ecological base flow to maintain the ecology in the region. Now, they brought this surface water quantity framework to my community, and we took it to our elders council. And, it was written in empirical Western science, and it was, I'm going to make up numbers here, so pardon me, but let's say it was 230 metric meters or meters cubed per second flow rate. It was some abstract, weird number, a flow rate of so many meters per second through the river system. And the elders and land users were like, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything to us. That means nothing. And they said, can you make it make sense? Make it make sense in relation to how we actually use the land. So they took some hydrologists and ecologists out onto the land, and they said, well, if the river had this flow rate, it would be about this deep right here. And so we know that the ecosystem needs this amount of water to be healthy. And the land users actually stepped in and they said, sure, okay, but will I still be able to hunt a bull moose, put it in my boat, and traverse back to my community? And the answer was no. The answer was no. And so when you think about this, why is this important? Because what ended up happening is when you looked at the interrelationships, the ways in which we actively participate and live with the land, it changed what the base flow rate needed to be in order for that ecology to be protected and still utilized. And it ended up almost doubling the ecological base flow that was necessary to protect the ecology in that region. They ended up actually naming it the Aboriginal extreme base flow. And it strengthened the capacities for environmental protection of the lower Athabasca region. You start to see how so-called anecdotal evidence actually has real merit in driving solutions that don't just protect my community's ability to continue to hunt a moose, but it protects the long-term longevity and survival of those ecosystems for many generations ahead. And we have to understand that these real solutions, I will let the translators change. These real solutions need to be driven by an understanding of our interrelationships with these lands, not lands as resources that we power our houses in, not lands and territories that provide us food for our fridges, not lands and territories that gonna give us the timber for our homes. These are places that have governed our people for thousands of years. These are the lands and territories that gave us the languages and the words that we speak in our own tongues. My people are called the Kaitale Denesotlene. Kaitale is a reference to the willows and the marshlands that we live in and the ecosystem that we live in. And those ecosystems gave us the words for our language. Each region of my communities and Dene communities have their own dialects that are driven from those ecosystems. There are words that each communities have that are so different because the land spoke to us in ways that taught us how to speak those words. And of course, colonization in time has evolved. And I think that's another thing we need to consider, is that there is no such thing as a static, traditional, Indigenous way to be. We are not pan-Indigenous, and we are not static. One of the most important remarks I ever heard was from a Sami Indigenous woman who got up on a stage during the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, and she said, "My people are not strawberry jam. We do not want our culture and who we are to be preserved for other people's consumption. We live now in today, and we are modern people that have evolved just like anyone else." And so we need to take into consideration that our real solutions driven by our ancestral knowledge can take Western empirical science and data, build it together to build solutions that take micro hydro and solar and all of those things and find a way to make them work. And we also have to take into consideration that some of those solutions do come at a price and a cost. Solar voltaic and rare earth minerals are being extracted at an exponential rate that are causing harm all over the world. And so we have to hold that justice framework in and build solutions that don't just support our communities where we are, but support a justice framework overall. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ariel. That was an incredible response. As we're kind of nearing the time for this panel, I'll hand this off to Danielle to answer.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick. I think my answer to this is a lot different than what it used to be when I first kind of started learning about, how these processes came to be and what legislation was. Growing up, in a sovereign nation on my reservation, even our governance, although we do have a tribal council, is very different. And so it took me a long time to actually wrap my head around the way that this system works and commodifies and capitalizes on things like this whole return on investment thing that every funder ever has going on. Just the return on investment is actually having an inhabitable planet. I don't know why that's not why that's not such a common sense, I never quite understood. I think I can wrap my head around the perspective a little more now, but it's something that when I think of, what actually I can actually think of as a solution is what works without this system. Our goal where I'm from is to be a sovereign nation, right? To have our rivers, to have our food, our ancestral foods accessible to us, to have our communities be healthy and sober and, just closer to the way that things are meant to be, the closer to the way things were before colonialism and before all the siloing of, the pain in our communities happened. And it's really cool that you guys each talked about the connection to our relatives and our neighbors, because our home is actually called Natinahue, so it's where all the trails meet, and so it's a very central location for tribes all around us. And yeah, I would just say that for me, an actual sustainable solution is something that's by us, for us, to get us closer to our own systems outside of this, legislative idea and governance, this system of food security, of community, of ceremony, things that get us closer to that, like language revitalization, like connecting with our youth and giving them access to knowledge our ancestors gave us, like going to ceremony and going to all of these spaces, making relationships with other Indigenous folks. All of those things, get us 100% closer to what used to be. And, I get a lot of, being in the hydro space, I get a lot of questions on, well, if you remove these dams, what replaces them? What about the energy that they put in? You don't want these projects to be put in the Amazon, but who's going to give who electricity? And it's just I don't, that's not the first thing in my head. It's these people's homes are not going to be underwater. They're going to have access to their own homelands. These people, their language is not going to be killed in the same way that ours was. And we're still trying to revitalize like these things like the Climate Dam Project, things like that are happening in South America right now. Proposals that we're actively fighting, trying to help our communities in South America not go through what we went through up here. Literally the exact same thing, and homelands being underwater, food sources being depleted, all of these things that happen to us. You know, we don't want it to happen to them. And so that's where that Indigenous solidarity like comes in, and that's a solution. And I would just say, like, you know, working with youth, they come into this in the best way because a lot of them are not as familiar with this outside system that we're all trying to work in, right? Like the first thing that they think of isn't how are we going to fund this? Who's going to support it? Are we going to follow it with some kind of policy change? They just think about things that are going to help, you know, make things easier for their kids, and they don't have to like do all the nitty gritty of things. And so that's why I think I'll always work with Native kids through any kind of work that I do, just because like they have that mind of, you know, they think of things, especially when they are like, you know, in our homelands, in these cultural like camps and things, they just think about what's going to make it better, right? Like what's going to make it easier for them to hang out with their grandparents, for their little sisters and brothers not to have to go through so much trauma. Like, how do they get to speak their language? Like really simple things. Like these are the solutions that we need in order to build our own system outside of this one that keeps trying to oppress us. And that's like where the solution lies in my work. You know, I'm still in school, still trying to figure out how we replace all this electricity and do that other things. But like the important thing is like I'm trying to figure out how we get back to the place that my great grandparents had, because that's what I want. That's what I've never had access to, and that's what I want to see before, you know, like I have kids. I want them to have something closer to that, because a lot of my trauma stems from not being close enough to that. And so that's I'll kind of leave us with that and just say, like, you know, following all these amazing change makers we have coming up right now is how I see us really being able to work outside of this system and find those ones that do support us.
Sweet. Thank you, Danielle. So we are kind of just a bit over time, but I wanted to open up the space for some closing remarks. It could be any, final thoughts or feelings from this conversation, any project that you wanted to amplify, maybe at like a personal or collective level, looking at you, Katie, with that one. But I will pass this off to Katie to start off our closing remarks.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone on this panel. I really appreciated learning about where you come from and what you've been involved in. And just definitely appreciating the part about Native kids. Like, I think my niece is on this call, so shout out to her. She was really just I was like, what should I say? And she was like, just talk about how you hang out with your family and you love your nieces and nephews, and all of that is true. Like I don't have any kids of my own at the moment, and I think children will always bring tears of joy to me, and just a lot of gratitude for the children, and to be able to love them and see them, and for all of us really to be working from that place of love is, I think, some of the most Indigenous ways that we can be, and has been robbed of us as Native people, with children being taken away, or spirits being taken away also as children, or at least trying to damage that. And so sorry, but the closing remark, and Willow I think is alluding to some of the things that I'm facing at home, which is a lot of criminalization, both within the Criminal Code of Canada as well as the civil court, where both parts in Canada has a common law system for the majority of Canada, except for Quebec, where they have a civil legal system. And for myself and for many Native people that have come before me, challenging those systems of law, the laws of order that uphold Canada, that uphold British Columbia, those are the things that it comes into conflict with every day, and where the police come from, where they get their power from, where the state maintains its power is within the courts as well as the legislature. And so for me, I am facing the criminalization of self-defense with, for example, fighting police officers and saying that, no, you don't have the right to remove me from my land or to stop me from protecting this land or from protecting my relatives or from giving my English name and using my Huamoxne. And so I will be brought to court in January. I'll be self-defending to say to the Victoria Police Department that they absolutely have no right to exist on stolen land. And so to me, that is also a part of some of these climate solutions, is denying the power of the state and using every ability that I have to ensure that I'm upholding that and practicing that as best as I can, and not showing that type of fear that Canada tries to instill in Native people. And it's a very real fear. Like, don't get me wrong, like, it is very real. There are very real physical consequences of, death or terrorism or many things in Native people's lives. And within the other aspect of the court system and being criminalized is through injunction law. And if maybe we could have an entire webinar about how injunctions are used against Indigenous people who are defending land. So at, hydroelectric dams, at the tar sands, at pipelines and harbors. So these court systems and the criminalization of Native people is something that I'm focusing on definitely with my time. And so upcoming, I'll be fighting some people in court and telling them that fuck the police and they cannot be here on stolen land. So yes, that's my closing. Thanks so much for having us. Thanks, Willow.
Oh, Katie, thank you so much for sharing. You deserve a life that is bigger than your ancestors' wildest dreams, because like your fight will, it will sustain us, and like it will be talked about and it will be learned from. And it's so important to highlight like how we are so criminalized as Indigenous people for showing up to protect the land, and it is for our communities, but it is for life itself on Earth, in Canada and places across the US and in South America. Like, these are the most biodiverse places on Earth. And tell me why we have land defenders in the Ecuadorian rainforest being murdered for resisting mining operations. In Canada and the US, we're met with paramilitary police forces for defending water projects. Like, this is life itself that we're being criminalized for, and it is unacceptable. And so all of the respect, admiration, and love to you, Katie, for embarking on this legal journey, and we will be there in support. And I'll pass this on to Tomas for some closing remarks, or if there's anything that you wanted to amplify.
Yeah, I just want to say first, I have driven all throughout the Dakotas. I have driven through the American South, and I have never been more racially profiled and never felt more unsafe than I do when I go to Canada. So just so everybody knows that, scary. I mean, next level racism. I'm just going to be real with you. So to all of my folks who are up there, y'all are in my prayers constantly, because that is some dark shit. And I'm from America. Okay, like, really, it's very scary. So my final remark: you're going to hear a lot of people talk about their fight, and their fight looking very physical, their fight looking like legislation. Sometimes our fights look like big actions. But what I try to tell every Native person that I meet is that the most radical thing that you can do in your life is be yourself, live your life, and be happy, honey. Because if you don't do that, if you don't give yourself that time, that respect, if you don't honor yourself like that, then ain't nobody else in this world gonna do it for you. You set the example for the way that people are going to treat you in the world. And so if you truly want to challenge these systems, you really want to fuck them up, hit them where it hurts, live. Become an elder. Pass on this knowledge. And be good to your body. Be good to your mind. Be good to your spirit. You don't have to fight. You don't have to go into a courtroom. You don't have to join a nonprofit organization. You don't ever have to step foot at a march or a rally in your life. And if you live to an old age and you get to see your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and your nieces and your nephews, then honey, you won this fight. Because one of the best things that I can say, and one of the most successful things that I can say, and one of the most radical things that I say, and the thing that pisses off every government more than anything is this sentence right here. We are still here. Thank you all so much.
That was that was so powerful. That was incredible. Thank you, Tomas. That was amazing. And I hope that everyone here that joined us, everyone on the panel, I hope that I get to see every one of you as elders, and I hope I get to see every one of you like share in the joy and the beauty and the bounty of our land, and we all deserve that. And it's because of people like you and conversations like this that like paved the way for that reality to be actualized. And I think what Tomas said as well about like Canada and the US, and I feel like the US is terrible to your face, at least they have the dignity to look you in the eyes while they kill you. Whereas I feel like Canada fronts and will bring you to this multicultural event, and then you leave with a knife in your back and you're like, what just happened? And yeah, I will pass this on to Danielle for some closing remarks or anything that you want to amplify.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Yeah, so just big, set dia, big gratitude for everyone who's here and in the virtual space, on the panel, in the audience. Coming together in places like these, even if it is virtual, is just like one thing that refills my soul during all the other things. So yeah, just really grateful for everybody being here. And I'll drop like the link to where I'm at right now in the chat. And right now I'm kind of my next big project. I'll be traveling down to South America, to the Biobío River Basin down in Chile with 13 Native kids from the West Coast. They're going to be spending like 8 weeks with some of our Chilean relatives down there, learning about Indigenous global solidarity and the importance and what that looks like to actually, find home in another person's space. And we're really excited about that. And it's one way that, I kind of been organizing for a while. I did the frontline protests and still do sometimes. I did like the whole community organizing, and this is a new space for me of just being able to focus on like these kids and like opportunities for them and happiness, and writing like good, true, curriculum to send to the school with them, and getting them opportunities to go hang out on other rivers with other Indigenous folks and just learn about like this world that we live in and how crazy it is, but also like how beautiful it is to be able to make relationships with other people and other rivers and other spaces. And so it's been bringing me a lot of joy lately to be able to come in this project and that be kind of my main goal, just providing amazing opportunities for these students to learn about river advocacy and the fish wars that happened in our communities, and just have education wherever they go with it is up to them. And, being able to support them getting outside on rivers. Yeah, it's been a dream. So just kind of wanted to bring them into this space as like the people and the space that rejuvenated me to come into this work wholeheartedly again, and just feel so good about it. And remind me that we don't always have to work in this system that oppresses us, that there's this whole other world that we own, that we are in charge of, that we can, invest in and work towards like all of these common goals. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about my kiddos, and you can, read about them a little bit if you'd like. But just wanted to uplift that, like, yeah, this doesn't always have to look like fighting in a courtroom or throwing down in legislation or even marching in front lines. Like, it could totally look like taking kids Native kids to another country, to connect with more Native kids and just like be on the rivers and provide good opportunities. That's where I'm at right now, and that's my focus. And yeah, it's been real good. So thank you guys for having me, and thank you. I look forward to seeing all of you again for sure.
Oh, thank you so much, Danielle. I'm so excited to hear that you guys are going down south and yeah, learning from each other, sharing experiences, and like our liberation is bound together, and it's bound outside of colonial borders. And so I'm really excited to see that you're taking all these youth down south. That's really exciting. I'll pass this on to Ariel for some closing remarks or anything you want to amplify.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just also like looking at some of the Q&A. I think there was a really interesting question in there around how do we work with nations, like Indigenous nations or communities that have made their fortune from oil and gas? And how do we work with the fact that there are poorer communities and wealthier communities? And I think that this is really important because it's a really big and long journey we're on. Because colonization didn't happen overnight or in 5 years, it's happened over the last 500 plus years. And to undo these damages is going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And I almost always do this, but there's a really great book that I consider one of my favorite books. It's called Columbus and Other Cannibals by Jack Forbes. And in the book, he equates colonialism as a disease, or a disease called the Wetiko disease, and the Wetiko being a cannibal. But one of the most prolific lines in the book, for me at least, was that the epistemology of the Wetiko disease is that no one is immune. And that many times as we try to fight the Wetiko, we succumb to it ourselves. We've seen this happen in our own communities where we are fed no other choice. We fight and we fight and we fight. I saw this in my own region where Chief Boucher, who was the chief of Fort McKay First Nation, literally was protesting and blockading the highway as a young person. And when he became chief, became the poster child for the oil and gas industry. And so we have to understand that this is not because our people have, have sold out. It's the system has worked them down. And we have to work with those, and we have to try to bring them back into this relationship, not just with oneself and their community, but that interconnectedness with the land. And that same interconnectedness that I talked about, and a lot of what all the speakers talked about, is that we need to be talking about solutions for the future that are not just tied to those capitalist colonial structures and systems. And we absolutely must be careful moving forward that we don't get sold new economic, saving systems that are going to bring our communities out of poverty and into wealth. Because it's wealth under whose definition, wealth under whose terms. And I really, really, really hope that we can start to build up our communities back from those places where we felt like this is our only solution. The only way for our communities to make money is through oil and gas, because the same thing will happen. It might be the only way our communities think we can make money is through commodifying the carbon of our forests or selling the rare earth minerals and wind and lithium batteries. We have to be careful about how we move forward. Again, this is about how we can come together, right our relationships with each other, right our relationships with the land, and how we can work together to not only fight the Wetiko disease, but to build our immunities and our abilities to not succumb to the diseases ourselves. And I just see so much power in the young people in this panel, the young people that continue to come up and push and challenge these systems. And I don't want to put this entire responsibility on you. It is the responsibility of my generation and those that are still in leadership from the generation before me, that they need to know that they have to create the systems and the structures so that you don't have to fight tooth and nail for that transformative justice that you're fighting for. When we talk about 7 generations, we don't need to just be talking about the 7 generations before. We need to reframe that ideology from the 3 generations before, the generation now, and 3 generations into the future. And the last piece I will state is that I heard a prophecy when I was in Alaska, that when our people lived through the last ice age, they knew the land was changing. They knew there was this big change in the land. And there was a call for a great council of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island to come together. And this council was to come together to share our understandings of the land, to share our understandings of how to survive this coming change of this ice age. And we had to compile and bring together our collective resources in order for all of us to survive across the different biomes of the continent. And at that time, there was a prophecy that while this seemed like one of the most trying times, that there would be a time in the future that would be exponentially worse than the climate change they were seeing with the ice age. And that once again, our people would have to come together in great council to share our knowledge to survive that time. And I do truly believe we are in that time, and we have to break down those silos that colonization has put us in and start to work together collectively as Indigenous peoples and as peoples wholly to overcome this climate crisis and share those knowledges to move forward in a collective, interconnected, and values-driven process, not an economic-driven process. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ariel, for that. That was awesome. And yeah, just great reminder about like the generations before us, the 3 generations before us, the generation that we're in, and the 3 generations to follow our lives. You know, I think I think it's easy to survive until the end of our lives and maybe even till the end of our kids, but sustainability and that abundance lies when we walk out into the world thinking of those generations that are 2 and 3 generations away from us. You know, and I just wanted to thank the panelists for joining us today. That was an incredibly beautiful conversation. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Tomas. Thank you, Katie and Ariel. That was really amazing. Thank you for sharing yourself, for your teachings, for co-creating this space and this incredibly powerful discussion. And I would like to also thank the communities of color operating in allyship for providing live ASL interpretation for this webinar. It is so wonderful to have you guys, and I'm so grateful to everyone that joined us today, to all the participants and the panelists. And on that note, I think we'll wrap it up. Yeah, thanks, folks.